Welcome everybody. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about how you can build up color and texture using oil paint. I've been painting now for a good 20 years, and for a good chunk of that time I painted in acrylic when I was doing a lot of abstract work. But when I made the switch to portrait painting, I did not like how acrylic worked as far as blending in brushstrokes to make those subtle shifts in tone and color. And that's when I decided it was finally time to make the shift into some other painting medium. And that's when I tried out oils. And right off the bat, the first oil painting I ever did, it was a still life. I knew this was the right move. I could blend in my tones better. All of my colors were shifting the way I wanted them to. But one of the best things that oil paint has going for it is its versatility. It's able to stay wet for the whole day, so you can paint wet into wet or alla prima style, but you can also let it dry and put a layer over top of the oil after a couple days, maybe 3 days, to let it be touch dry, and then you can apply your paint kind of like you might if it was acrylic. And that is how I like to approach my paintings. I like to utilize both of those abilities. I like to start my day off like this painting and just paint wet into wet, get those shapes into place. I'm not really worried about everything being perfect. I just want to get those general compositional elements there. I want to get the dark to light while using very subtle colors. I know later on I'm going to build color. With each layer I'm going to go over this and add more and more color to it, and I do that in a way that's very dramatic. But the one great thing about oil that I think is maybe not as strong with acrylic is its ability to create textures. You can create a lot of fine brushstroke textures, but you can also apply it with a palette knife and it retains those marks a lot better than acrylic, in my opinion. And I do go over these things quite a bit in depth with my tutorials on my Patreon account, so if you are interested in learning more about how I approach my paintings, you will find the link below in the description. One thing I do want to note regarding acrylics is there are tons of different mediums out there for acrylics and a lot of different ways to utilize acrylics as well. So if you find that acrylic is working for you and you want to continue using it, by all means keep going with acrylic. It may be that it just works better for you than it did for me. I think the best thing you can do is check out all the different types of mediums out there, whether it's watercolor, gouache, ink, oil. All of them are perfectly capable of creating portraits. You just have to find the one that speaks to you, the one that just seems more effortless maybe than the others. But if you are just determined to make oil work or determined to make ink work because you saw an artist that just makes amazing works with that medium, just keep plugging away at it. It probably is just a matter of putting a lot of willpower towards something and not giving up. At this point with this painting, you can see that I'm starting to dial in those details a little bit. I'm still painting wet into wet, and that is where I like to take advantage of oil's ability to blend and make softer edges, but also blending in subtle color shifts. And that's just something that I find is unique to oil paint, that ability to stay wet all day long, add textures, add subtle color shifts, all these things that can be done without having to use any glazing techniques. And that is definitely one of those things that me personally, I like to avoid doing, is using a lot of glazings. I find that glazing techniques are great for certain artists and what you're trying to accomplish, but for me, I want that paint texture to really come out. So I avoid using any glazing techniques for the most part, unless it has something to do with the surrounding portions of the painting where maybe I do want to have a smoother texture. But I'm always going back for more paint so that I keep adding more and more texture as I go. Now, as you can see, at this point in my painting, I'm starting to finally make some additional color changes after waiting for the painting to dry. So it's been a few days since I did that first part of the painting where it was just those subtle brown colors. I knew that I did want to use some purples, but that was my spot, to wait for it to dry, wait just a few days so it was touch dry, and then jump right into some very intense purples. And that characteristic of oil paint, where you can paint wet into wet and then wait for it to dry, I want to take advantage of every aspect of the oil painting's properties. So in a way, you could almost say that the oil paint is telling me what I can do with it. And that's going to happen across all the different mediums. It'll have advantages and disadvantages, and you just want to work to its strengths, but maybe even try to make some of its weaknesses become a strength. So that's what I do with my oil paint. I know that it can dry after a few days, and then I can paint over it. I know that I can paint wet into wet and work with the tools that I have at my disposal. And that's another thing that I like to do with oil paint, is use a lot of different tools, because that is how you keep adding more and more texture. With each layer, you can go in with different brush sizes, palette knives, rollers, whatever the tool might be. I like to throw in some squeegees here and there. And the oil will retain a lot of that texture. Unlike acrylic, obviously watercolor and gouache, those don't really have a lot of texture. Oil is, I would have to say, the king of texture. When it comes to any medium where you want to create a lot of interesting expressionism and brush marks, I would say oil is going to give you the best chance of accomplishing that. Regarding adding color changes and adding more color or less color with oil paint, there is a little bit more of a learning curve, I would say, at the beginning, especially when you're trying to paint wet into wet. There's a lot of factors that go into play that you wouldn't really have to consider as much with those other faster drying mediums. And the biggest tip that I could give you when you're doing this is to paint thick over thin. So when you first start painting, that first day where everything's going to be wet into wet, make sure that you apply the paint thin at first and get everything masked out, get the locations of the shapes, and then slowly start using thicker and thicker paint. You can do this by either thinning your paint with linseed oil or odorless mineral spirits. A lot of different mediums out there to thin your paint, but you don't want to go thick right off the bat, because it will be very difficult to change the color of the paint that's already applied. Now at this point in this painting, I have probably put on a good 4 to 5 layers. What I do is I cycle through a lot of different paintings, so I'm not just waiting for one painting to dry and just sitting and twiddling my thumbs for a few days waiting for that to happen. I will have a rotation of multiple paintings that I am working on, so that once I get through a few paintings, I can go back to this one and keep adding layers. So it ends up taking a little while to finish a painting this way, and it maybe isn't the way a lot of artists would like to do it, but it's just my method. It makes it unique to my style. And there are definitely ways to speed up the drawing process. There's different mediums that can make your painting dry in about a day, and at least then you don't have to wait as long between sessions. And all of these mediums have their pros and cons. Some of them maybe will cause your paint to darken after it dries a little bit more. So make sure to do some research and figure out what medium will work best for what you're trying to accomplish. Now at this point with this painting, I'm starting to finally put in those last color shifts that I wanted to add to make the painting have a little bit of blue pop to it. And that was a lot easier to do because the layer below was dry already. And with just a few brush strokes left, I want to just quickly again mention that on my Patreon page, you'll be able to learn a lot more about my process. You'll find that in the description below. Thank you so much for watching another one of my videos. I will talk to you again next week.